It's time to wake up and quit sleeping on these players in fantasy football. We're going to be talking about 9 of them in today's episode of the Fantasy Football Fellas podcast. Welcome in. My name is Lucas Wenzel, and as always, I am joined by my co-host Cameron Lawrence. No Tyler tonight, this morning when you listen to the episode, but have no fear. We have called in the big guns to replace Tyler this episode. We are incredibly grateful to have Dave Kluge of Footballguys join the show tonight. Dave, thanks for giving us a part of your time. Where can the people find you? What do you do over at Footballguys? Tell the people a little bit about yourself here.
Yeah, I make it super easy. You can follow me on Twitter at Dave Kluge, and I tweet out everything, whether it's a random thought that pops into my mind, whether it's an article that I wrote, a video I'm doing, or a video that I'm guesting on. You know, whenever this show comes out, I will be sure to share it from my Twitter as well. So I keep it really simple. Just follow me on Twitter at Dave Kluge. You know, might be transitioning over to Threads or Blue Sky or Mastodon or something at some point, but for now, Twitter it is.
Or whatever new social media invention comes out next that Elon could get frustrated about. At any rate, no, Dave's a great follow over on Twitter. Yeah, he posts a ton of great stuff over there. Definitely worth following him and getting a load down on all of his content, for Footballguys. As I said, we're going to talk about sleepers in fantasy football this year. On today's episode, we're going to talk a little bit about what actually is a sleeper. It seems like there's conflicting opinions everywhere about who can be a sleeper. How late does a sleeper have to be? We'll break that down, give a little bit of clarity, and then we'll go ahead and drop some knowledge on 9 different players who we think people are sleeping on in fantasy football this year. So I won't waste anybody's time anymore. Let's dive on in and actually discuss what a sleeper actually is. Let's just start with that simple question. Dave, I'll just kick it over to you right away. How do you define a sleeper in fantasy football?
Well, that's a really good question. And I get that often because, you know, hosting my own show, we talk about sleepers. And some people, when you say sleeper, they're saying, who is this the guy you can get in like the very last round of your draft? You know, somebody that nobody is talking about. And, you know, I'll have some people on a show and ask them for a sleeper and they go as deep as Travion Williams. And then I have other people come on my show talking about sleepers and they're talking about Christian Kirk, you know, in the 4th or 5th round. So really what I look at is somebody who just isn't getting the respect that they deserve. Somebody that you think is assuredly going to outperform their ADP. Of course, nothing is assured in this industry, but I think when talking about sleepers, you try to find the guys that you think that there is a major deficiency in their value and how you perceive them to be. So for me, some of my sleepers are deep. Some are, you know, a little bit earlier in the drafts, just guys that I think have a very strong likelihood of outperforming their current ADP.
So how would you, I agree with almost everything you said there. So how would you differentiate a sleeper versus just a value at ADP? Because I think we throw those terms around the industry quite a bit in terms of, well, I really like, I'm trying to think of someone, we'll talk about him on today's episode, but James Conner, right? I really like his value at his ADP. I would consider him a sleeper because he isn't getting that hype. Is it like a balance of like hype and value at ADP? Is it just a value at ADP? Like what is the, like, if you had to put like a percentage blend on it, how would you balance out? Or maybe that's just a nuanced question. You're saying, Lucas, you're wasting your time asking this.
And you know, it's so much like how lucky we are like in our industry and where we're at in like the timeline of humanity that we could spend so much time talking about nuance and syntax and things like this and the meanings of words. Like, you know, if we were born 100 years ago, we'd be worried about where we were going to get our water in the morning so we can drink. Now we get right here and talk about the difference between a sleeper and an ADP value. But really, when I try to think of a sleeper, the people that pop into my mind are the guys that aren't being talked about often. So I think like James Conner, for instance, James Conner has been a steady fantasy producer for what, 3, 4, 5 years now. He's somebody that we can consistently rely on. So I don't know if I'd be able to throw him into the sleeper conversation because he's somebody that most people are aware of already. But that being said, if he gets pushed down to a certain point, then he does become a sleeper. So there's a lot of gray area there. And I think how we label these guys. But I think the theme for today's show are guys that we all like much more than their ADP reflects. Yeah.
We'll duke it out later on whether James Conner's a sleeper or not. I won't spoil that. That's my pick. But he is one of the players we'll talk about amongst many others. I want to actually ask another follow-up question too. And Cameron, you can chime in whenever as well. So you brought up like someone who isn't getting the attention. So like I see a lot of like Dameon Pierce is a sleeper. Cam Akers is a sleeper. Yet I'm seeing their ADPs inch up by the day. And when does a player not become a sleeper anymore? because that's also one where I get very confused all of a sudden, where I see Cam Akers, sleeper. Well, his ADP has jumped like 8 running backs in the last like month. So I don't consider him a sleeper anymore. But like, is there a cutoff in your opinion there?
Yeah, just woke up at a certain point, no longer sleeping. Now he's just fully
right.
awake. Cam, I'll let you take this one.
Yeah, I just think it, like, when you're looking at your Twitter timeline, if you got 7 tweets out of your last 15 about one player being a sleeper, he's not a sleeper anymore. I think that's just, it's like, and I always use my rankings to determine where a sleeper's at, right? I'm usually looking like 5 or 6 spots away from where I have them ranked compared to where the ADP is. But like you said, if we're talking about Dameon Pierce as a sleeper at like running back 26, and now we're drafting him at running back 20, if he's moving up that far, moving up close to a round, then you're like, all right, because that's where that value kind of goes away. So that would be kind of what I'm determined as not a sleeper anymore, is like you said, if they're moving up 4 or 5 plus spots in ADP, and every single person you hear about is talking about them, they're not a sleeper.
That's kind of like a long-running joke that I have, is that you could make a killing in your dynasty leagues. Just whoever, like, you know how it is. Like, players trend for a week where everybody's saying this guy's a buy and this guy's a sell. When everybody is screaming this guy's a buy, sell that player. And when everyone's screaming they're a sell, you go out and buy that player. If you just do the opposite of what the hive mind is telling you to do on Twitter, you can typically make a pretty good living playing dynasty.
Yeah, actually.
Go for it, Cameron.
What it makes me think of is, whatever, was it 2 years ago when Russell Gage joined the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and every single person was saying he is the biggest sleeper, and then all of a sudden he was like almost a 7th round pick, and this was a guy who deserved to be a 12th round pick. That's kind of what changes someone from being a sleeper to overvalued, in my opinion.
Yeah. Gabe Davis got sleepered all the way into round 4 last year.
Yes, exactly.
Yes. Yeah. I like how you also touched on, like, this is a lot of buy low, sell high. If everybody is screaming somebody's a buy low, well, guess what? Nobody's going to want to sell that guy low anymore. They're going to want to actually get a realistic price on him if everybody is coming after him. So yeah, it's a funny game when we play in this industry of when somebody is a sleeper, when somebody isn't a sleeper. We're going to get some polarizing opinions from time to time. So maybe the best way we can provide examples of who we think sleepers are and why they potentially even qualify as a sleeper is by breaking them down ourselves. So let's go ahead and transition to 9 sleepers in fantasy football this year. And Dave, I'm going to start with you. If you start with the guy that's first on your list here, this is a guy who I am singing high praises of this offseason. And I think there is a serious opportunity for him to easily outperform his ADP and just slide past everybody in drafts.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about Marquise Brown. This is a guy who has been in auto draft basically for me in almost every underdog draft that I've done so far this offseason. And we saw during his entire career in Baltimore that he was just a ticking time bomb that was just waiting to explode in fantasy production. Just year after year, all of his underlying peripheral metrics were showing that he was a very good player, but he was hampered by this Greg Roman high school-esque type of offense that was focusing on running the ball with the quarterbacks and running backs and checking down to tight ends. And he was never really able to fully spread his wings and fly in that Baltimore offense. But we saw last year what a player like Marquise Brown could look like in a pass-heavy offense with a good quarterback. Not saying that Lamar Jackson isn't, but Kyler Murray throws the ball much more efficiently than Lamar Jackson has historically. And what did we see during that 6-game stretch? 10.8 targets per game. He was the wide receiver 5 in scoring, behind only Stephon Diggs, Cooper Kupp, Justin Jefferson, and Tyreek Hill. Over those 6 games, he was on pace for over 1,400 yards and 8 touchdowns. So talking about like on a macro level, these are the types of players that you want to invest in. Kyle Pitts, Drake London, there's a lot of these guys that are really good players, but just aren't on offenses that really provide a lot of fantasy football production. But then we saw the trade happen and we saw what happened on a better offense. And now DeAndre Hopkins is out of the picture. So the stage is set for him to be the clear-cut wide receiver 1 target hog in Arizona. Now, right now there's a discount and you can get him for cheap because we don't know who the quarterback is going to be. It could be Clayton Tune. Maybe they bring back Colt McCoy. But I think at some point, Kyler Murray will return next season. Now, there's a few different ways that this can kind of work out. Either he comes back early in September and he's healthy and great. You got the steal of the draft with Marquise Brown. But even if he comes back later in the year, I think that there are multiple reasons for him to return. One, the least likely scenario is that they are contending and they want their star quarterback back for a playoff push. But the more likely scenario is that they're sitting at 2 to 3 wins and they're contending for the number 1 overall pick. And they want to try to get Kyler Murray out there to to show that his knee is healthy and give him a little trade boost before the offseason hits. So then that way they have options, whether they want to stick with the number 1 overall pick or if they want to trade Kyler. Whatever they decide to do, they have increased their leverage by showing that Kyler Murray is healthy. So right now, if you're drafting Marquise Brown, know that there are probably going to be some down weeks early in the season when he's playing with Clayton Tune, but you're drafting him knowing that he has top 5 upside if and when Kyler Murray returns at the end of the season. And those playoff games late in the season are so much more important than the early season regular season or the early season games in your fantasy football regular season. So I'm trying to get as much Marquise Brown as I possibly can this year.
I couldn't agree more. No, I couldn't agree more. I feel like there's also something to be said in terms of they'll be throwing the ball a ton too. So like not that necessarily automatically leads to production, but you brought target hog specifically. I'm not going to be surprised if Marquise Brown is the guy seeing 8+, 9+, 10+ targets consecutive games to start the season. It's not going to be pretty. I'm not going to promise you that, but no, I couldn't agree more. Cameron, anything you want to add on Marquise Brown?
Yeah, it's just like Lucas has really got me in on Rondale Moore as a target later in drafts. In our last episode, I just sniped him in our mock draft episode on Rondale Moore. But the difference between Marquise Brown and Rondale Moore is quite a big gap, right? No matter how much I like Rondale Moore, I think Marquise Brown is just such significantly better of a wide receiver than he is. So even if it's a backup quarterback, Marquise Brown is going to be the one to see those targets. And so even if you look at it like, hey, you draft Jameson Williams, whatever. I mean, he's going 3-4 rounds after, but he's suspended. You kind of look at it like that. These first 6 weeks, I'm getting without, but you could still have a great week within those first 6 weeks, even if that's what Kyler misses. So I just think the upside's too great to pass up. I mean, he's like wide receiver, 31? Is that what you said? It's ridiculous at this point.
And Marquise Brown, it just seems, you talked about they're going to be playing from behind often. I just see Marquise Brown. You've all had these guys on your rosters before where you go into the fourth quarter and he's got like 2 catches for 18 yards and then somehow finishes the game with 7 catches and 120 yards and a touchdown. And you're just like, all right, cool. I don't know how that happened, but that is the type of game style that we're going to be looking at from the Cardinals this year. It's not going to be pretty, but he has shown that he can draw targets at a high rate. He can catch contested balls. He can do things after the catch. He draws targets in the red zone. He does everything you want to see from a fantasy football wide receiver. And right now you're getting him at a huge discount because of the ambiguity in Arizona.
Couldn't agree more. We'll move on. We won't beat a dead horse here. Cameron, you're going to flip-flop positions on us here. Guy who's gotten a little bit of hype this off season, but I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are on your first sleeper.
It's the next Christian McCaffrey. No, I'm just kidding. If we've heard for four straight years that he's the next Christian McCaffrey, and he's not going to be, but it's Antonio Gibson. He's running back 31 on Underdog. He's running back 33 on Sleeper. And I'm not saying he's going to all of a sudden be a top 12 running back, but I was surprised when I was looking back that he was the running back 13 in 2021. I had to text Lucas and make sure and double check that is an actual stat because I didn't believe it at first because I had forgotten he had 260 carries that year, which for me just felt mind blowing. 1,000 yards, 7 touchdowns, 42 receptions and 52 targets. But then last year's running back 28 and his carries went down 149. 546 yards and 3 touchdowns. And then J.D. McKissic got hurt halfway through the year, and you're kind of hoping, hey, we're going to see that receiving work from Antonio Gibson. Excuse me. Absolutely not. We saw an uptick of 4 receptions on the entire year. He only had 2 games over 7 targets, which is just disappointing all around if you had any belief in Antonio Gibson, because we knew Brian Robinson was going to come in and steal carries, but we were just hoping that, hey, maybe Antonio Gibson takes that next jump, right? He came out of college. He was a wide receiver in college. You're hoping he gets that receiving work, and he just didn't. But what has me excited is, first of all, is the addition of, oh my gosh, I didn't write his name down. I can't even think. What's the offensive coordinator?
Eric Bieniemy.
Oh my, why did I forget that? That was like, that was like my whole argument's based on him. But just the addition of Eric Bieniemy and what we saw last year with Jerick McKinnon. Now I understand a big part of McKinnon's fantasy value was touchdowns. I'm not saying Antonio Gibson's going to have 9 receiving touchdowns in 11 weeks or whatever, but McKinnon's reception totals were exciting to me. After the bye, he went 8-8. These are target totals, sorry. 8-8, 1, 6, 2, 9, 8, 3, 6, 3. Right. And for Antonio Gibson to only have seen 2 games of 7 targets or more, that would be an exciting boost for his fantasy value. And I definitely think he is a better rusher than McKinnon was. And I think Brian Robinson, especially efficiency-wise, is a worse rusher than we saw Pacheco last year, right? Robinson was at 3.9 yards per carry last season. Gibson was down at 3.66. Neither of them were great, but I think they're going to mix in enough rushing the ball where this hopefully extra bump for Gibson and receiving-wise is, I think, going to allow him to outperform his current ADP of running back 31 on Underdog.
That's interesting. Like you started to come around on Gibson. I don't think I've sold myself on Gibson yet, though. There's been some hype around him, wanting him to be more involved in the offense this next year. Dave, any thoughts that you have on Antonio Gibson and potentially being a value or sleeper here at running back 31?
Yeah, I mean, at its, purest form, this argument is simply betting on the talent, and Antonio Gibson is a very talented player, and we haven't really seen it all come to fruition so far throughout his NFL career. But Cam, you talked about him wanting to hopefully get involved a little bit more in the passing game, and 58 targets doesn't seem like a ton, but that was actually 12th most last year, and he did that over the last 2 years, seeing 50+ targets in back-to-back years with J.D. McKissic on the team. And J.D. McKissic does nothing except catch passes and fill in the pass blocking game. So over the last 2 years, despite missing half a season, J.D. McKissic pulled 93 targets over the last 2 years. So with him now out of the picture, we've got to assume that some of those targets are going to go Antonio Gibson's way. He was a wide receiver in college. We know he can do things with the ball in his hands in space. So he's a guy that I have been drafting a ton as well. Brian Robinson, great story last year, coming back from the injury and all that. But like you said, he just wasn't really that efficient running the ball. And he's got some fun, angry runs that make Good Morning Football, and that's why people get excited about him. But overall, he's not a player that you want to be your lead back. So I'm completely with the idea and the take that Antonio Gibson can take a stranglehold on the backfield this year. Love that call.
Yeah, I think the other thing, too, was you look at the Kansas City Chiefs last year, they had 108 running back targets, right? And Brian Robinson had 12 targets last season. So there's a huge, disparity between those two numbers. So we could easily see Gibson, start encroaching on that 70 target number, which would be pretty awesome if you're drafting him at the running back 31.
Yeah, we will pray for that to happen. As someone who was a heavy Antonio Gibson truther over the past few years, only to be disappointed last year, I will pray for those numbers to come up in the receiving game, give you a boost of upside in PPR, half PPR formats as well. I'm going to stick at the running back position for my first sleeper. And because we foreshadowed him at the start of this episode, I will go ahead and just discuss James Conner right away and make the case for why I think he is a sleeper at his running back 27 ADP. And the reason, his ADP is just being driven down by a multitude of factors. I will just go ahead and name them all right now because they're all somewhat legit in fair argument. The Cardinals are going to be bad. Not many scoring opportunities. There's going to be no Kyler Murray the first chunk of the season. A lot of these are what Dave has already laid out. He's a big injury risk. James Conner hasn't had a clean bill of health throughout his career. He's certainly missed a bit of time along the way. He's not an efficient runner. And there's a new coaching staff. All these tendencies are going to change. It's not a Cliff Kingsbury, watch how many times I can feed James Conner within the 5-yard line around the red zone. I'm going to go ahead and kind of discuss and debunk these one by one here. With the fact that the Cardinals are bad, can I just remind everyone the Cardinals were 4-13 last year? It's not like they were competing for a playoff spot last year. Kyler Murray did miss a chunk of time last year as well. I'll touch on that in a minute. But even though they were bad, they continued to lean into James Conner. They could have given Keontae Ingram more opportunities, yet they chose to continue feeding James Conner. So I'm not so concerned about the Cardinals being bad. It might lead to less scoring opportunities, sure, but we already saw James Conner's touchdown totals, come way down last year. I believe he only had 7 on the season. Now, no Kyler Murray the first chunk of the season. Part of me thinks James Conner is just better without Kyler Murray. I don't know what it is, but you look at his numbers without Kyler Murray last year, he averaged 19.5 fantasy points per game in PPR formats. That was in weeks 10 and 11 and then 14 through 17 without Kyler Murray. He even thrown the 3 games from 2021 as well. Now, albeit one of those was a monster 40-point game, but he averaged 21.5 fantasy points per game. So now over the last 2 seasons, you're looking at a guy who was averaging at least 20 fantasy points per game without Kyler Murray. That doesn't concern me as much. That doesn't concern me if I've already seen him be productive in fantasy formats without Kyler Murray. Now, He's a big injury risk. He's not an efficient runner. I really have nothing to argue against there. Those are just indisputable facts about James Conner that I don't have a retort for. But I also feel like those are just kind of like baseline, like anti-arguments you could apply to a multitude of running backs. You could say most running backs are injury prone. That's a strong word. You could say most running backs are feared to be injured, and a fair share are inefficient as well. But I will not dispute those. Then you look at the coaching staff, the tendencies will change. Now I'm going to go ahead and pull a piece of news that came out today that, yes, does inflate my argument a little bit, but you saw Drew Petzing. He does run a more run-first offense, and you saw James Conner come out and say, I just love the possibilities. Yes, it inflates my argument, but I guess that just adds to the point of like, I'm not concerned when he's the second best non-quarterback weapon on this team. He was 8th in opportunity share last year too. And once again, Keontae Ingram is the only backup. I don't know who's taking that opportunity share from James Conner, especially when even in the receiving game, DeAndre Hopkins isn't in town anymore. I find it hard to believe James Conner just isn't going to be the guy in that backfield. His 17-game pace for receiving volume, I didn't even touch on that. 75 targets last year. That would have been seventh most. Now, again, he may not play the entire season. We know that. But if this Cardinals team is going to be playing from behind, that's a lot of check down opportunities for James Conner potentially. So where does that leave us? After I've debunked all those arguments, where does that actually leave us?
I love James Conner.
What was that?
Sorry. I thought you were asking us. I didn't. I misunderstood. That is so my bad. I'm so sorry.
Give me 2 seconds and I'll be done. You can chime in. No, where that leaves it with James Conner, a running back that can catch the ball in a run-first offense that's averaged 20-plus fantasy points per game without the starting quarterback for the past 2 years, and they'll be playing from behind a lot. That kind of sounds like a good recipe for James Conner for me. Again, I understand the scoring goal line opportunities aren't going to be there. Your only concerns are that and injury and efficiency, which can be applied to, I would say, at least 50% of running backs. So I'll keep taking the value. That's why I think James Conner is a sleeper, but I also understand Dave's point of, well, yeah, he's been top 10 in fantasy points per game the last 2 years. I don't know how much of a sleeper he is, but I think that also why it makes me think James Conner is a sleeper at running back 27. If we've seen him be top 10, why are we still drafting him as a running back 3?
Yeah, I will jump in now. Sorry about that. I was just so excited to say I agree. That was really all I was going to say too. So I'm sorry, Lucas, I just cut you off there. But yeah, I've been drafting him everywhere just because, like you said, he's been running back 10, and I think he's one of those sneaky good receiving backs that we don't give receiving back credit to, right? I mean, we saw it last year. Like you were saying, he was on pace for almost 70 plus targets, and we just don't really count him as a quote unquote receiving back. So I think he can inflate his value a little bit, especially, if even when Kyler comes back, he's not gonna be running as much. So there will be more checkdowns to James Conner.
Yeah, and I'm looking right now, and that's really what kind of piqued my interest a little bit, because we talk about the splits with and without Kyler Murray, that he was averaging over 21 points per game without Kyler Murray. But we know what type of quarterback Kyler Murray is. He likes to run the ball, and those are terrible for running backs. And you see it, with Justin Fields and Jalen Hurts and Cam Newton back in the day. They really make it tough for running backs to find success. And the splits with and without Kyler Murray, with Kyler Murray, James Conner averages 2.6 receptions and 2.8 targets and 2.6 receptions per game. But without Kyler Murray, he's averaging 5 targets per game. So he's basically doubling his usage in the goal line. In the passing game. And then when they get near the goal line, I was trying to tie two thoughts together at the same time here. But then when they get near the goal line, when Kyler Murray's out there, we know he likes to scamper, and he will take the ball in on his own legs. When he's not out there, the quarterback's going to turn around and put the ball in James Conner's belly. So when Kyler Murray isn't playing, he sees an uptick in targets and he sees an uptick in goal line work. So that's why it makes him that much more valuable. The one last thing I'll say is he dealt with some injuries last year, and he was limited in a few games. But if you look at games where running backs played 60% of their snaps or more throughout the game, James Conner was actually 8th in scoring. He averaged 18.1 points per game in those outings, behind only Joe Mixon, Saquon Barkley, Cam Akers, Josh Jacobs, Austin Eckler, Derrick Henry, and Christian McCaffrey. So we know he's getting a heavy snap share. We know Kyler Murray's not going to be able to play early in the season. James Conner could realistically be a 20-point per game running back to start the year.
And that could carry him out. They'll get you off to a strong start. And I get, once Kyler comes back, those numbers could certainly dip. But we just don't know when Kyler's coming back. We don't have a clear timeline for that yet. So I will continue taking the value there until it starts creeping up closer to that 20 range, and I might start thinking twice then all of a sudden of, all right, how much further can that running back 20 finish carry me, considering he was the RB 19 in fantasy points per game. He was 19 overall, last year, even with injuries. Before we transition to the next 6 sleepers, why don't we take a quick break and hear from our friends over at Underdog Fantasy. Today's podcast episode is brought to you by our friends over at Underdog Fantasy. Now, we love Underdog. It is the easiest place to play best ball formats, and they even have their own form of player props called Pick'em. You can make up to 20 times your money on a single night by correlating props together. 2 picks will triple your money, 3 will 6 times it, 4 will 10 times it, and 5 plays that all hit will multiply your entry by 20. You can even place insurance on your picks too, so if only 4 of your 5 props hit, you still get 10 times your entry. And if you use our code FELLAS when signing up, Underdog is going to double your first deposit up to $100. Alrighty, we are back, and we are going to continue talking about sleepers in fantasy football for this year. And we're actually going to make a transition of positions almost entirely. We've talked about skill position players thus far, well, non-quarterback positions thus far. So I'll go ahead and spoil the position of Dave's next sleeper. But Dave, why don't you go ahead? I've enjoyed the light sprinkle of propaganda that's appeared on my Twitter timeline from you over the past few months around this player. So who is your second favorite sleeper going into 2023?
So first of all, I want to apologize to anybody that listens to my show or is a subscriber at Football Guys, because I have been relentlessly touting this guy all off season, but I wanted nothing to do with Russell Wilson last year, and he was terrible by all intents and purposes. You know, he had a bad 2022 campaign, but now I think that we have just overcorrected with where he is getting drafted in 2023 drafts. Last year, you saw a career low in touchdown rate and a career high in interception rate. Also saw the lowest PFF passer grade of his entire career. I don't think that Russell Wilson just fell off the backside of the age cliff and forgot how to play football. He's only 32 years old. We typically don't see that happen with elite quarterbacks for a few more years. I am chalking last year up as an outlier, and I expect him to get back on track in 2023. Now, I don't want to sit here and try to play psychologist, but just try to think through it a little bit. I mean, this is the first time in Russell Wilson's NFL career that he has to play with a new coach. He was playing in a new city. He was playing in a completely new scheme than what he has done for the last decade. So it's understandable that there could have been some growing pains there. I'm willing to just chalk this up as one bad year and hope that he can get it back. Now, historically, we know the type of guy that Russell Wilson has been. He has been a top 10 quarterback for 8 straight seasons, and 4 of those 8 seasons, he was a top 3 quarterback. So he possesses immense upside, not just like a back-end quarterback one upside. One of the best quarterbacks in fantasy football is the upside that he brings to the table. And this season, they did whatever they could to put him in a better situation. First of all, they can't get out of his contract. So there's no chance Russell Wilson is going anywhere. If they cut him after this year, they have to eat over $80 million in dead cap. So rather than trying to get out of the contract, what did they do? They surrounded him with better talent. They designated $140 million to Mike McGlinchey and Ben Powers to beef up that offensive line. They also brought in Samaje Perine, who is a specialist in pass blocking and in pass catching. Last year, that was one of the things that we saw from Russ that we hadn't seen in years past. He wasn't able to make a living on his legs like he had done previously. So what do? They just set him up with some more protection so he can play out of the pocket and be a little bit safer when he drops back. Now, we've also got Tim Patrick coming back, who a lot of people don't even remember the name, but he has been dealing with injuries for a couple of years, and reports out of Denver are that he looks great so far, and that's completely behind him. Javonte Williams could come back at some point this year, but we've also got Courtland Sutton, 2 years removed from his ACL injury right now. The team also spent a second-round pick on Marvin Mims, so there are a lot of new pieces to this offense that should help him. And then, of course, the team traded a first-round pick for Sean Payton. So there are so many reasons that you can see Russ getting back on track this year. But if all that didn't do it for you, let me just go ahead and talk about Nathaniel Hackett, who was a joke of a head coach. I mean, just absolutely terrible last year. And at the end of the year, after Nathaniel Hackett was fired, granted, we saw it on a very, very small sample size, so don't get too mad at me for extrapolating here. But over that time, he was the quarterback 2 behind only Patrick Mahomes. I'm not saying he's going to be the quarterback 2 over the whole season next year. I'm not saying he's going to outscore Josh Allen and all these guys, but it does paint a picture for the upside that he brings. So Jerry Jeudy and Greg Dulcich are 2 young and ascending stars that will anchor this passing game to go along with all the other weapons that I talked about there as well. So I just see him getting back on track this year. I don't think that he forgot how to play football, and the team has done everything they could to right the wrongs that they made in 2022. Right now, he's getting drafted as QB 18. So if you're playing in a super flex league, or if you're playing in best ball where you need a backup quarterback, then you're obviously thinking about him. But even in single quarterback leagues, if you know that you are in a league that has deep benches or leagues where there isn't a lot of trading, he's a guy that I'm willing to take with one of my last picks and stashing him on the bench just in the hopes that he can rebound back to the top 3 guy that we saw. And if it doesn't work out, no big deal. You cut him midseason, and it's not going to completely tank your roster. The cost to acquire Russell Wilson right now is close to nothing. He is actually being drafted as QB 18 despite finishing as QB 17 last year. So he's getting drafted below his floor. If you draft him right now, it is all gas, no brakes, nothing but upside there. I can't get enough of drafting Russell Wilson this year.
I have nothing. That was a masterpiece. I have nothing to add to that because those are all the reasons why I am also back in on Russell Wilson this year. I have a follow-up question to that, but I'll let Cameron chime in here first with anything that he has.
Yeah, I just think, like you talked about the weapons, and you can say, oh, I don't know about Tim Patrick or Cortland Sutton or Marvin Mims, but it's like there's just so many of them that even if they're all 75% of what we expect, that's more than probably 90% of offenses. Like you look at Patrick Mahomes, I'm obviously not comparing Patrick Mahomes, but like that offense, they make it work with, the pieces that they have. And it's pretty clear, other than Travis Kelce, that the Broncos got a lot better pieces on their team. And they just have so many of them that you can be worried about the pieces, but they're like, I just don't think you can be worried about him as a whole having people to throw the ball to.
Yeah, and the other, I know we just did the best ball promo, and we were talking a little bit about that. And one of the reasons I like Russell Wilson so much is because of all of the stacking options, whether it's Dulcich or Judy or Javonte Williams that you're drafting early, or if you want to wait and get Samaje Perine, Marvin Mims, Tim Patrick, Cortland Sutton, these guys, there are endless stacking options. I don't know who the guy is going to be in Denver this year as far as the premier pass catcher, but I do know that I want the guy throwing the ball to all these weapons, and that's Russell Wilson,
who's playing under Sean Payton, who has done a thing or two with short quarterbacks in his coaching career. Just to throw that out there as well. Dave, you did bring up Superflex. So like to maybe transition us to that realm of fantasy football versus best ball for a moment. Where would you take Russell Wilson in a best ball draft? Now that maybe is a little bit putting you on the spot there, but I'm looking at my Scott Fishbowl draft board here, and I'm thinking like, oh, where should Russell Wilson be going in the midst of this super flex league? So yeah, if you had like a perfect spot where you would like to draft Russell Wilson, where would that be for you?
So his value has been all over the place this offseason. I did a 16-team Superflex Dynasty startup earlier this offseason where I got him in the 6th round. And then I did a 12-team redraft Superflex draft just a couple of months ago where I got him in the 4th round. And now in Scott Fishbowl, I see him consistently going in the mid to late 3rd, but I've also seen others where he's dropped into the 5th. So his value is all over the place. And I think nobody has really been able to, peg exactly where he should be because we know the upside is there. We saw the downside last year, but currently in my rankings, pulling him up right now, I have him as my QB 15. So I actually prefer him ahead of Kirk Cousins, which is probably the spiciest of the bunch. But Kirk Cousins, the way that I look at him, he's not going to lose you your league, but he's not going to win you your league either. And if you're looking for a late round quarterback, you want the upside. So I think that it's likely that Kirk Cousins outscores Russell Wilson this year. But if there's a chance that one of those guys cracks the top 3 or the top 5 fantasy finishers at the end of the year, it's more likely to be Russell Wilson. I also have him ahead of Aaron Rodgers. I had him ahead of Jared Goff as well. So for me, it's the upside that is very alluring. When you're drafting in the early rounds, you want those safe guys that you can depend on for the entire season. But once you get into round 15, 16, 17, you're swinging for upside. And the same thing with the QB2 and Superflex. I think you want the guy that's going to give you a lot of upside because you're not going to win your league with 2 back-end quarterback ones. You want those high-end guys.
The only thing I disagree with there is that you just spoke ill against Kirk Cousins as Minnesota Vikings on this show. No, I mean, as I see Chicago Bears, and we know that you're a Chicago Bears fan, Dave. But I asked that because I'm in the middle of Scott Fishbowl, and Russell Wilson went early in the 5th round, and I'm going, ooh, where is that? Was that a good value pick? Was that a value? And the more I thought about it, the more I'm going, yeah, you know what? Actually, considering the manager who drafted him also drafted Trevor Lawrence in the 1st round. yeah, that's a pretty good 2 quarterback start there. I would consider if you're drafting, tail end of the first round and getting into the early 5th round there. So,
and the other thing I'll say with Scott Fishbowl specifically, for anyone not aware, this is a tournament with thousands of people playing. You're not going to win Scott Fishbowl by playing it safe. So if you can swing for the fences on a guy like Russ and get him in the 5th round as your QB2, if he does hit, whoever drafted that team is going to have a huge advantage over everybody else that was paying up for him with a 3rd round pick.
Yeah, for sure. 100% agree. 100% agree. Cameron, I'll kick it over to you because you're also going to talk about a quarterback who you like at a value this year. And I'm still debating if I am in on this quarterback or not, but I'll let you make the pro argument here for this quarterback.
So I went with Matthew Stafford, and the way I looked at this was mainly from a best ball point of view when I was coming up with him. Obviously, I don't like, he doesn't have the upside of Russell Wilson. I just don't think in the offense he's in, with where he's at, right? He's an extra three years, I think, older than Russ. I don't think he has that same where if everything went right, he's cracking top 5 again. But I do believe that if everything goes right, he can crack top 10. But like I said, looking at it from a best ball perspective, this is a guy who has Cooper Kupp on his team. And would any of us be shocked if Cooper Kupp has a 200-yard, 3-touchdown game this season? Probably not, right? Cooper Kupp is ridiculous. And so if Cooper Kupp's going to have those big games, right, Matthew Stafford has to at least have a couple pretty decent games. But there are some real obvious concerns with Stafford, and that's why he's going at the quarterback 20 last season, 12.9 points per game. Abysmal, right? That is Andy Dalton range. That is not what you want to see. Elbow and back injuries that have, come up multiple times throughout his career, and talent wise of the roster, there just wasn't really an improvement anywhere. But he also is only 1 year removed from 4,800 yards, 41 touchdowns, a QB5 finish, and a Super Bowl win. He still, like I mentioned earlier, has Cooper Kupp and Sean McVay. And I just don't believe that Stafford's going to come back after all of this crap if he doesn't believe that he still got it to some extent, right? I don't believe with the retirement, stuff going around with Sean McVay and Aaron Donald that they're going to come back if Stafford doesn't believe that he really has it anymore. And so that for me plays a little bit of a role into it, but I just think the fact that he is only 1 year removed, if he does come back healthy from that, I'm not expecting 4,800 yards. I'm not expecting 41 touchdowns again. But I do think he's a guy who can be in that running or that quarterback 12 range. That guy that you could stream against certain defenses, that you can kind of pick your places with. And at the quarterback 20, if you're looking at it from a super flex, there's really not that many guys behind him. Because personally, I'm out on, Jordan Love's being drafted right out after him. I'm out on Jordan Love this season. Kenny Pickett, I'm not in love with. Bryce Young, CJ Stroud. There's nothing pretty after Matthew Stafford at quarterback 20. So I just think he's the last kind of quarterback there that really, for me, has some great upside that you could grab. And I think he's one too that if you ended up grabbing him, he's at the end of your bench, like Dave was saying, in a real deep redraft league, you would know after week 2 if you're going to cut him or not, because you would know he's either got it and shows, or if he doesn't got it, it's going to be pretty obvious for him.
Yeah, I mean, and again, 1 season removed from quarterback 5 in 2021. There has to be something in him. Maybe it's just a competitive spirit, and we could chalk it up to a competitive spirit that Matthew Stafford is coming back to actually play this year. I'm just very intrigued to see what upside there is, if any, there. But if you're looking at a quarterback 2, like the upside, seeing what we just saw in 2021 is there. It's not non-existent. I don't know if I can certainly talk myself into Stafford, but the opportunity for him to end up a sleeper is certainly there, given what we know about this dynamic Sean McVay offense. Dave, I don't know if there's anything you want to throw on top of that.
All I'll say is things can't get worse than they were last year. I mean, they had no offensive line, and he was playing through an injury. And like I talked about with Russell Wilson, the team kind of needs to figure it out, because if they cut him this year, they're eating $111 million in dead cap. If they cut him next year, they're eating $91 million in dead cap. If they cut him the year after that, they're eating $42 million in dead cap. So I hear this like narrative that keeps getting spun that the Rams are going to attempt to tank this year. There's no way, because if they tank this year for the #1 overall pick and draft Caleb Williams or somebody like that, they're not going to be able to cut Matthew Stafford. They're paying him way too much money to put him on the bench. So they have to figure out how to make this work with Matthew Stafford. Cooper Kupp coming back off the injury. He should be back to 100%. I am completely with it. You know, I like disagreeing with people because I think it makes for fun content, but so far I've been in lockstep with all the takes that you guys have laid out so far. I find myself drafting a ton of Matthew Stafford this year as well.
Yeah, I do got to say my favorite stack right now, late round stack in best ball, has been the Cooper Kupp, Matthew Stafford, just because, you know, Stafford's free for that stack. Obviously, you got to pay up for Kupp. But I believe, you know, Kupp is fully back. And after what we've seen the last 2 years, he's just too good to pass up.
Yeah, and right now people are chasing Stafford because of the Kupp stack. Like if you're drafting Kupp with a 3rd, 5th pick overall, you want to assure you're getting Stafford late, which is naturally pulling his ADP up a little bit. By the time you get to your home leagues and your regular redraft leagues, Stafford's going to be free. You're not going to have to pay up for him at all. When people don't care about stacks, you can get him in the very final round of your draft as a QB2 just to see what happens.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, so far we're batting 1,000 with Dave in terms of what he agrees and doesn't agree with, and so far I think we're pretty much all in lockstep, as he said. So I'll put it to the test with Jahan Dotson. This is not the first time you've heard me talk about Jahan Dotson, and I promise you it's not going to be the last, because if you've probably seen it across our socials, I have called Jahan Dotson the best kept secret in fantasy football this year. I called Christian Kirk the best kept fantasy football secret last year, and I am just riding that train again. And I don't think I screamed Christian Kirk praises loud enough at the beginning of last offseason. So I'm gonna do it even louder this offseason in hopes that people actually catch on. I think Jahan Dotson's like the most underrated sophomore wide receiver coming into this year. Like Treylon Burks is getting more hype, despite being in what I would guess is probably going to be the worst offense this year. That I think that could be up for debate, but Dotson was also taken ahead of Treylon Burks in the draft. The draft capital favors Dotson, and now this isn't a debate between the two, but obviously Jahan Dotson was injured a good chunk of last season, right? Really turned it on from week 13 on. He was a wide receiver 15 in fantasy points per game, and during that stretch he led all Washington receivers in targets with 35. He led them in targets per route run. He was targeted on nearly 30% of his routes, and he averaged 2.48 yards per route run as well. Those are great numbers, and if he's leading the offense in those metrics, that gives me some hope going into this year. And I would even say he was nearly just as good as Terry McLaurin during that stretch as well. Just looking at their numbers in terms of yards per reception, Terry McLaurin had 15.3, Dotson had 16.4. Kind of fit the profile of how they were used in the offense, but I'll keep going. In terms of air yards, Terry McLaurin had 238, and Jahan Dotson had 233. Yards after catch, 113 to 111. Target share, 23.1. Jahan Dotson actually had a larger target share at 23.8. Not much of a difference, but they're pretty much in step here. And then you look at fantasy points per game. Terry was the higher scorer, but only by 0.8 points, 15.5 and 14.7. So Cameron mentioned earlier, you add Eric Bieniemy, who, after now seeing what Dotson was able to do last year, is probably going to scheme up more opportunities to get the ball into his sophomore wide receiver's hands. Then you get to the question of, well, who's throwing him the football? And the amount of times I have seen, well, who's his quarterback in our comments? I think a part of me just dies with that comment, because we're really going to pretend that Sam Howell and Jacoby Brissett are like any worse than Taylor Heineke and quite literally a shell of Carson Wentz. Like I don't know how it's supposed to get any worse than that. We saw Jacoby Brissett support Amari Cooper last year. So there is certainly upside to be had with Jacoby Brissett even than over those two. So just looking at ADP, right? We look at Terry McLaurin. He's going in that, low end wide receiver 2 range, somewhere between wide receiver 20, 24, depending on the draft that you're in. And Dotson's going in the wide receiver 38 to 40 range. Given everything I've just talked about, I would much rather take the discount on Jahan Dotson, who I think has legit top 25 upside this year if they get the ball into his hands enough and they continue to feed him in the end zone as well. So, like, as much as people love Terry as a wide receiver 1, like, I do think he will be the higher scorer than Jahan Dotson this year. But I'm just going to take all the Jahan Dotson I can get as people continue just disrespecting him and really, again, sleeping on him all the way down at wide receiver 38. His ADP is slowly starting to creep up. It started at 42 like way back in, I can't really say way back in May, that was only 2 months ago, but back in May, he was all the way at 42. He's creeped his way up to 38 now. But like, considering I think he has that top 25, top 30 upside this year, like I still think people are sleeping on him down at wide receiver 38.
Yeah, I love Jahan Dotson as well. Again, this is going to be for a pretty boring show because we're all just nodding along and agreeing with each other here. But Jahan Dotson's been one of my favorite targets this year for pretty much all the reasons that you laid out. Yeah, I mean, we see this often. The parallel I've been making a lot is Michael Pittman. Michael Pittman was a second-round pick and spent his first year injured, and then everybody just completely forgot about Michael Pittman going into year 2 because he couldn't play through the injuries. And then all of a sudden, boom, Michael Pittman is this dominant player in year 2, and he's getting a ton of targets, and he's doing things after the catch. And Jahan Dotson, well, they're very different players. When you look at size and speed and all of these things, he is just that forgotten player from the 2022 draft because he dealt with injuries. But yeah, he's a very talented player, and I think that he could bounce back this year.
Yeah, I look to, like you mentioned Treylon Burks, he's going around. George Pickens for me as well. I think I think you could consider Kenny Pickett as unproven as kind of that Washington quarterback room right now, especially like if Jacoby Brissett is starting, I don't know how much different they're going to be, at least fantasy wise this season. So I think there's just a lot to like. And like you said, wide receiver 40, 41 right now, where he's going is, it's just going to be, I feel so easy for him to outproduce that you're not going to regret taking him at that spot, unless of course he's injured, but you can't control that.
Yeah. I find it hard to believe there's not much of a floor below that than the wide receiver 38 and wide receiver 40 ADP. Like the only way is truly up from there. Let's bring us home now. We got about 10-15 minutes here to quickly wrap out our last 3 sleepers that we want to discuss. Dave, you're going to help us hit for the cycle here. We're going to talk about all 4 relevant fantasy football positions. No disrespect to kickers or defenses, but let's be real. We only want to talk about the 4 main positions. So you're actually going to help us hit for the cycle here, Dave. There's a tight end who I hate to say it. We're going to keep this a fairly boring episode because this player you're going to talk about is a favorite of the podcast.
Nice. Well, I'm excited to talk about him, and I'll do my best to get this one out for anybody watching on YouTube. I was just like choking on my own spit, and I've got tears rolling out of my eyes right now. But Chigoziem Okonkwo is a guy that I cannot stop drafting this year. And, oh, man, I really hope that I'm not falling victim to this year's Albert O or this year's Jonnu Smith, because we do see these guys every single year. But right now, the underlying peripherals for what we saw from Chigoziem Okonkwo in his rookie year are absolutely mind-blowing. Now, if you look at the overall production, there really isn't much to write home about because he was a part-time player for the majority of the year. I mean, he only had 450 yards at the end of the season and only caught 3 touchdowns. So what we want to see when we look at players like this are the underlying peripherals, like I talked about earlier with Marquise Brown, and I kind of alluded to Drake London and Kyle Pitts. These guys on per route run data are just absolutely smashing. And last year, Chigoziem Okonkwo was first among all tight ends in yards per route run. He was actually 3rd among all NFL players, behind only Tyreek Hill and A.J. Brown. Yeah, that's right. Tyreek Hill, A.J. Brown, Chigoziem Okonkwo. So then you look at targets per route run, and we're looking, this is, how many targets they were able to draw each time they ran a route. He was 2nd among all tight ends, behind only Kyle Pitts. But then again, you look at all of the NFL players, it's Tyreek Hill, number 1, Amon-Ra St. Brown, number 2, Cooper Kupp, number 3, Kyle Pitts, number 4, and then once again, Chigoziem Okonkwo. I mean, we see this guy popping up in lists with elite company. And the big knock right now on Chigoziem Okonkwo is that he is undersized. Well, I think that's such a silly argument because he might be undersized for a tight end, but you don't want him playing tight end. You want him playing wide receiver with the tight end designation. That's what we see from guys like Mark Andrews and Travis Kelce and Kyle Pitts. These good fantasy football tight ends make a living playing in the slot and playing out wide. And last year, Chigoziem Okonkwo played 34.5% of his snaps in slot. He took 13.9% out wide. Less than half of his snaps were actually taken in line as a tight end. And in every single game, we saw him playing less and less in line. Now, the one last thing I'll say, there's no target competition right now in Tennessee. I mean, Treylon Burks, don't get me wrong, good player, but Chigoziem Okonkwo on an efficiency basis and a per route basis was actually a better receiver than Treylon Burks was last year. Now, the show's airing tomorrow, so let's pray that we can make it through the evening without DeAndre Hopkins signing in Tennessee, because that would make me backtrack on this take a little bit. But as it stands right now, Okonkwo is a realistic shot to be the #1 target in this Tennessee offense. And right now you can draft him as a back-end tight end 1, and his upside is being one of those top 3, top 5 guys if he can put it all together on a full sample size this year.
We've seen yards per route run for tight ends be one of those most predictive stats too. You look at guys like Andrews and Kelsey who early on in their careers where, yeah, right after you see those yards per route run spike, they ended up being all right for fantasy football, I think. So Chiga's on a fast track to potentially become one of those top 5 options, which I 100% agree is within his range of outcomes. Cameron, I don't know if there's anything you want to add on to that, because we've been singing his praises. We've been singing a lot of those same praises, and Dave is just continuing to put icing on the cake of why we love Okonkwo.
Yeah, it's just it's the tight end 12 right now, right? The drop off for tight ends is so fast after like tight end 7. So even if he is, not great, the next Albert O, it's not like you're missing a great tight end later on. And if you are, it's just a complete shot in the dark. So yeah, I'm going to take that upside shot on Okonkwo pretty much every time.
I think that's a good point too, for where you're getting him. It's a crapshoot at tight ends after the first 6, 7 of them. So guess what? If Chig doesn't end up working out, you're going to go ahead and just stream another tight end anyways. Like, 50% of fantasy football managers are already doing.
And he's a guy that I'll target even if I do get Kelsey or Andrews or Hockenson or Waller. I'll still take Chig as a tight end too, because tight ends, if they do hit and people think that this is the next big tight end in fantasy, carry so much value on the trade market. So even if you've already got Mark Andrews or a guy that you're going to be starting as your tight end, keep Okonkwo, stash him on the bench, because if he gets off to a hot start, then you flip him for an RB2 or a wide receiver 2, and then you get that immediate production that you can put right into your lineup for a tight end.
100% agree. Cameron, I'll let you bring it home here with another sleeper. We're going to transition back to the running back here with your final favorite sleeper for 2023.
So my guy is Rashaad Penny. He is going as the running back 37, running back 36, or running back 37 on Underdog, running back 36 on Sleeper. And if we want to talk about a lottery ticket, I think Rashaad Penny is the definition right now. Last 2 seasons, we've seen him at 6.1 and 6.3 yards per carry. And now he gets this Eagles offensive line. But he's also only played over 10 games once in his entire career. He's on a $1 million contract. And so I just think he can go both ways. And I do want to preface it. For me, this would depend on where you're at in your roster construction. I would not prefer to take him as running back 3. If I'm taking him later as my running back 4, I do like him a little bit more, because I don't want to have to necessarily lean on him to be a consistent producer, to be a guy who stays healthy. But if I can add him as my running back 4, add him as that depth piece, then I feel excited for what's to come, because we saw last season Miles Sanders 1,259 yards and 12 touchdowns. They brought over DeAndre Swift, but Swift is not a between the tackles runner, right? And that's what this team does. We saw it last season. This team only threw to the running back position 61 times. Swift is not going to be a guy that they're going to necessarily highlight. I think they'll obviously target the running back more, bringing over Swift. But I think Penny, as long as he stays healthy, is the best runner on this team. And I just think the upside for him of what he could see, the way they run inside the 20, the way they run inside the 5, I just think what he could be so great. But like I said, he really does feel like a lottery ticket at this point of, he could be pushing top 15 at the end of the season and you could be the happiest guy in the world, or he's out of week 6 for the rest of the season and they don't really use him at all. So,
or he might not make the team.
Yes,
his contract is certainly cuttable as well. They didn't invest a lot into him, but I think you do bring up an important point though, Cameron, of some of these players who we can identify as sleepers. They commonly, I think, get categorized into 2 categories. One, they're on teams that suck. So there's not much upside. There's not much perceived upside there. The public thinks they're going to suck. A Marquise Brown, for instance, right? Like we already talked about. Number 2 is that there's a lot of risk associated with them. But if that risk pays off, holy crap. Like you said, you struck the lottery, you struck gold there. And they instantly become, wow, man, I can't believe we were sleeping on that guy. He could have been so good. Well, it's just because Rashaad Penny does carry a lot of risk. I don't think it makes him any less of a sleeper, but I think it is important you at least point those things out. And obviously the offense that he's in, it could be an absolute home run potentially on how they use him. Dave, what are your thoughts on Rashaad Penny?
I love him. I mean, he's been one of my favorite players. Obviously, you know exactly what you're getting with him. If he's healthy, he is. I don't say this lightly. He's one of the best running backs in the NFL. When he is healthy, he is dominant. The issue is he's never healthy. I actually pulled this the other day. In NFL history, there's only one guy that has as many yards per carry as Rashaad Penny with a minimum 300 carries throughout his NFL career. Have you guys ever heard of Marion Motley? Probably not. He fought in World War II, literally fought overseas in Europe, came back from Europe, played linebacker and fullback for the Cleveland Browns. And we're talking 1946 to 1955 is the only guy in NFL history to have more yards per carry than Rashaad Penny. You look at the top three: Marion Motley, Rashaad Penny, Bo Jackson. I mean, this is how good this guy is. It's just, you know, that he struggles to stay healthy. But if he is healthy, one of the best running backs in the league, on one of the best offenses in the league, there's nothing not to like.
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more.
I was going to say, and I'm like, man, you know what? I have nothing to retort because I do agree. If I have an opportunity to snag Rashaad Penny as my running back 4, especially in a best ball draft, holy crap. Like, that is like gold and music to my ears.
Yeah.
I'll keep my last one short and simple here because we're going to get a little bit nasty and dig down the board here for someone who maybe you'd consider more of just a late round flyer. But I want to do a quick bit on Nico Collins. I don't think it's a debate to say that Houston's wide receiver 1 is up for debate. They brought in Robert Woods. He could be an option. John Mechie, potentially returning from leukemia. What a hero if he ends up doing that. And then there's Nico Collins. And I would be putting my money on Nico Collins. He's entering only his 3rd year in the league. That might be new knowledge to people. When I read that, I go, oh, I thought Nico Collins was older than that. Only his 3rd year in the league, and 3rd year breakout wide receivers are still a thing. I think we've just been extra spoiled with the likes of, you know, Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Jalen Waddle, Chris Olave, Garrett Will, just to name a few guys who have come on and just set the league on fire right away in their rookie years. I still think there's room for Nico Collins to have a small little breakout season in 2023. He saw improvement from his rookie year last year. He increased his percent of snaps from 62 to 72, saw a 10% increase there. 19% target share last year. There's room for improvement, but I'll tell you what, that could certainly be worse. 24% target rate. That's a certainly respectable number. And maybe the best part, though, this dude is a contested catch beast. 2nd in the league. He had a 66% contested catch rate. That could be a nice little bump for Stroud, helping Stroud become more comfortable, taking more risks at the NFL level, pushing it downfield more to a guy like Nico Collins. So I also don't want to get reckless. Again, take a four game sample size. Dave mentioned this earlier. We don't want to just project this over a whole season, but we look at Nico Collins from weeks 10 to 13 last year. Keep in mind, Brandon Cooks was still playing in weeks 10 through 12. He had 36 total targets. That was an average of 9 per game. For a guy like Nico Collins, I think that's pretty impressive. He only caught 19 of those passes, so really didn't get to capitalize in PPR formats, left some yardage on the table as well. But he averaged 12 fantasy points per game over that span. Now, I don't want that sample to be representative. I don't want that sample to spark false hope, but those targets were earned. We say targets aren't earned stat. You don't just stumble into, demanding 9-10 targets if you don't actually have the talent to earn those. And those were earned, as I said, with Brandon Cooks on the field in weeks 10 through 12, albeit that was amidst the time where Brandon Cooks actually want to be a Houston Texan, does he not? But those are all signs, as I mentioned, of a potential wide receiver 1 for a team that honestly didn't get a whole lot better this offseason. And they'll still be playing from behind in majority of their games for hopefully a pass-heavy game script. And you're taking Nico Collins as the wide receiver 50, somewhere between the wide receiver 55 and the wide receiver 60. And again, maybe you consider that more of a late round flyer. I'll consider it a deep sleeper for the 2023 season. I'm really good at throwing a dart on Nico Collins for upside at that point instead of taking a guy like Tyler Boyd, who you're dependent on a T. Higgins or Jamar Chase injury and is much more of a floor guy than an upside guy.
Yeah, I like Nico Collins a ton. And over at Football Guys, we just recently wrote an article about our favorite undervalued wide receivers. This is a roundtable article where everybody on staff kind of contributes to this. And I wrote up about Nico Collins, but so did Jason Wood, so did Jeff Hasley, so did Chad Parsons. We had a lot of sharp people on staff that are in on Nico Collins this year. The metrics last year look good. You know, he usurped the wide receiver 1 role from Brandon Cooks, who has been a longstanding wide receiver 1. Yeah, I mean, it's really hard not to get excited about his outlook. I think one of the reasons is he was everybody's favorite late round sleeper last year and didn't put it together over a full 17-game season. So now he kind of falls into that post-hype sleeper category, which are my favorite type of sleepers because they burned everybody last year. Then you get them on an additional discount the following year. So yeah, I'm all in on Nico Collins too. Again, I'm sorry for making such a boring show. I really wanted to come here and tell you guys you were wrong, but you just happen to tout all my favorite players.
That's why we brought you on the show, Dave, to tell us how wrong we are. No, no, totally joking. Cameron, any final thoughts you want to add on Nico Collins? Otherwise, we can bring it home here.
So I've been finding myself taking the shot on John Mechie just because of draft capital, just because of what he was at Alabama. Obviously, I know like he is a John Mechie. If we're talking about like a dart throw, like I think John Mechie's way more of a dart throw than Nico Collins is with everything that he's coming back from. But that's just where I've personally been at. But I still think that Nico Collins, even if John Mechie came out and played great, I still think Nico Collins could still have a pretty decent role. And like you said, he's going wide receiver 55 to 60. It's not like you're investing anything in him. So I agree too with what you said about, you know, taking him over at Tyler Boyd. You want someone with upside there. You want somebody who you could be like, hey, you know, this is great. I can plug him in sometimes, whereas like Tyler Boyd, you use in case of emergencies. Just make sure you don't have 0 points in your flex spot.
100% agree. We'll wrap out the episode on that. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Fantasy Football Fellas podcast. And thank you to Dave Kluge of Football Guys for joining the show. Dave, one more time before we sign off here. Where can the people find you? Where can they find the Football Guys work? And I won't put the pressure on to give a little sneak peek into what's happening over at Football Guys. But I'll say last time we had Hayden Winks on, he tossed us a little bone and gave a quick little weekly winners promo before it came out. No, I won't make you do any of that. But where can the people find you? Where can people find the Football Guys work?
Well, first of all, thanks a lot for having me. This is a good time. You know, I've been watching you guys for a little bit now, and really excited to see your growth and everything in the industry. It's been great to see. But you can follow me on Twitter at Dave Kluge. I just made an announcement yesterday, so we're recording this on Tuesday. I made the announcement on Monday that the Launchpad is being canceled at Football Guys, which is my baby. I came up with this vision years ago. It has been a awesome show. Was nominated for Best Football Podcast by FSWA last year. So really disheartening to have to get rid of that, but we're going to have something new coming to the Football Guys channel. And if you thought one show a week was fun, I'm going to be doing a little bit more in the 2023 season. So follow me on Twitter at Dave Kluge, and you'll see that announcement when it comes out, hopefully on Wednesday afternoon.
Exciting times over at Football Guys. We're excited to see where that takes you, Dave. And again, we're thankful for you taking a bit of your time, come join our show. And we appreciate the praises you present as well. So that is it. We will wrap out the show there. Thanks for tuning in. Make sure you do follow us, subscribe to the YouTube channel, turn on those notifications so you do know when episodes come up. Leave a little review on the podcast. We would greatly appreciate that. Helps boost us up the ratings a little bit. But for now, we will be back later this week with 5 wide receivers who have insane upside on YouTube. We'll be back with another full podcast episode next week. We will see you all then. Deuces.